In the year 1520, every church in Western Europe was a Roman Catholic church, a fact which had not changed since the dawn of Christendom. Yet by 1540, the picture was much different, because now people of several new Christian denominations could be found worshiping in many of these same churches. In a short period of time, a religious revolution called the Protestant Reformation had taken place, and as a result, nearly 16 centuries of unbroken Catholic domination of Christianity ended in Western Europe. Now let us find out what led to this rebellion against what was then the wealthiest and most powerful institution on earth. Early in the 14th century, several important events occurred which later would cause serious problems for the Church. The first happened in 1302, the year that the Pope issued a formal decree stating that salvation was not possible outside the Roman Catholic Church, and that ultimate truth and power, both religious and political, came only from the Pope. The second happened 7 years later, when turmoil within the Church caused its capital to be moved from the city of Rome, where it had been located for nearly 13 centuries, to the southern French town of Avignon. Here at Avignon, a magnificent new papal palace was constructed. It rose high above the rest of the town, symbolizing the enormous power of the papacy. The palace soon filled up with fantastic treasures that were crafted from gold and ornamented with precious jewels. But as beautiful as these objects were, an over-fondness for riches led to corruption at the papal court. For so great was their wealth and love of luxury that people were very disturbed by it. Then, in 1337, as the Pope's palace at Avignon continued to grow in size and splendor, a violent war erupted between France and England, a war that would last for over a century. While just 1 decade later, in 1347, a massive outbreak of the Black Plague brought death to 25 million Europeans in just 4 years' time. To the horrible problems of war and plague, the Church added a third problem of its own, when factions in Rome elected a second pope. So for the next 31 years, popes at Avignon and Rome battled for control of the Church. To make matters even worse, a third man was elected pope, so that from 1409 to 1415, 3 men struggled for power. Eventually the Church resolved this situation, but by now tremendous damage had been done to its prestige. Many ordinary Christians didn't know who to believe anymore. They mistrusted their religious leaders, for in them truth and goodness seemed to have been replaced by arrogance and corruption. To these believers it seemed that the simple teachings of Christ had been abandoned, and that the Church was in desperate need of reform. Yet at this time, people who spoke out about changing the ways of the Church could be put on trial and, if found guilty, burned at the stake for heresy. That was the fate of early Protestant reformer Johannes Huss in Czechoslovakia, and of a monk named Savonarola, who was publicly executed 500 years ago in the central square of Florence for denouncing the immorality and corruption of the Renaissance popes. But one man, Martin Luther, was able to escape the unfortunate fate of some of these earlier reformers. And because of his strong beliefs, both the religious and political character of Western Europe were changed forever. Martin Luther was born in northern Germany in 1483, and as a youth he lived for several years in this house in the town of Eisenach, while he attended the nearby church school. This must have been a fascinating time to have attended school, since people were just beginning to talk about the recent discoveries of Christopher Columbus. And this was also the time that, thanks to the invention of a new kind of printing press, the mass production of books was allowing information and ideas to spread rapidly for the very first time. In 1501, after finishing his early schooling, Luther moved east to the great cathedral city of Erfurt, seen here, where at first he attended its university, and then later began to live at this monastery after joining its community of hermit monks. And although the religious life he was required to follow here was very difficult, it seemed to suit him quite well. For a short time later, he was ordained a Catholic priest. After leaving the monastery, Luther went to the university at Wittenberg, and it was here that he was to spend most of his life, working as a professor of theology, teaching biblical scripture. And it was also in the town of Wittenberg where the first step was taken that was to lead directly to the Protestant Reformation. On October 31st, 1517, Luther arrived outside the doors of the castle church to post a list of 95 criticisms he had compiled, protesting the church practice of selling indulgences. An indulgence is a spiritual favor granted by the church to sinners. The church teaches that through indulgences, the punishments for sins that have already been forgiven by a priest are eliminated, thereby removing obstacles on the path to heaven. In the early days of the church, indulgences could only be obtained by making difficult spiritual sacrifices, such as going on a pilgrimage to a holy shrine. Unfortunately, by Luther's time, the original, purely spiritual intention of indulgences had become corrupted, for now indulgences were an important source of income for the church, and could be purchased for cash, just like any other commodity, with no need for any spiritual sacrifice at all. And it was this practice of turning something spiritual into a mere business transaction that brought Luther's condemnation at the church of Wittenberg Castle. Then, a short time later, Luther publicly criticized other church practices as well. As a consequence, he was visited by the Pope's emissary, who attempted to stop him from stirring up trouble for the church. But Luther's response was to say that he had no faith in the Pope and trusted in the Bible alone, that he had searched its pages carefully and could find nothing that supported either the sale of indulgences or the Pope's infallibility. And when the Pope sent a letter commanding his obedience, he simply hurled it onto a bonfire. Luther stubbornly refused to yield, and soon published 3 revolutionary books that were critical of the church. And even though their sale was officially forbidden, these writings were openly sold all across Germany. Finally, on January 3rd of 1521, Luther was banished from the church. But his troubles did not end there. The secular ruler of the German states, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, sought to punish Luther even further, for the emperor was a strong supporter of the Pope. Charles summoned his representatives from their castles in the far-flung states that made up his vast empire, ordering them to come to the German city of Worms.